Perfect. So yeah, just kind of to start off, we are both familiar with the report at this point, but just because maybe people who are watching the video won't be, could you just kind of give a brief summary of what the major findings of what you think are the most important things that people should be aware of?
Yes, well, thank you so much for taking an interest in this latest report by Open Doors. It's something that we really had a heart to do because we wanted to get the most complete picture of the persecuted church landscape, if you like. And we realized that this picture would never be complete if only the static church were considered. And so being able to try to look at the displaced church and those who are being persecuted along that displacement journey was really important for us. And one of the major findings was that actually this displacement, this eradication from a Christian community from their village, from their town, from their country, it's actually a deliberate strategy of religious persecution. And I think before, we have considered the fact that displacement may sometimes be an unintentional byproduct of persecution, but we have to look very carefully at when it is intentional and why is there that intentionality.
Yes, that's actually one of the questions I wanted to touch on. Do you think you could elaborate on how exactly you determine what amounts to intentional and what just is incidental? Because that seems like it could be really difficult to tell the difference, especially in individual situations.
Yes, and so anybody who works in the displacement world knows that the whole displacement, what causes people to reach that tipping point of moving, can sometimes be a very complex question. Perhaps those that are forcing the displacement are not only motivated by religious reasons, but there's also ethnic, financial resources, other motivations that are there. And so we have to take those into consideration. Now, when we look at this, we're looking at the fact that religious persecution and that larger dynamic in that country is actually trying to remove from a particular geography a Christian population, which is very often some people who live in a specific quarter of the town or a particular village. But also displacement, intentional displacement, can take place on an individual level where family members find it unacceptable for the Christian to stay within their community and within their home. And that's also a smaller scale, but just as intentional practice. And that individual believer is forced to flee their home and flee their community and eventually cross a border somewhere.
Okay, thanks. So just switching gears a little bit, one of the next questions I wanted to ask was, what can we do to ensure humanitarian actors are religiously literate and understand how to respond to religious persecution, especially because probably the vast majority of these organizations are going to be secular in nature? Like, I know there's a few, like Catholic Relief Agency and the like, but most of them aren't. So how can we kind of ensure that there's at least a baseline level of understanding and religious literacy?
Yes, and that is such an important question because along the displacement journey, very often somebody arrives fairly quickly in some kind of safe center, refugee camp or IDP camp, and then it's a government or, as you say, some sort of humanitarian organization which is taking it over. And they may be following UN protocols for how to process people. And in those set of protocols, we're asking that religion should be recognized and even headlined as an additional factor of vulnerability in the assessment of the individual. So along the entire process, along the entire journey, there are opportunities where perhaps the individual actors who are processing refugees may come from an ethnicity and therefore also religion that is hostile to the Christian, whatever their denomination or profession. So we also recommend that freedom of religion or belief principles really be strongly embedded in all anti-discrimination programs for protecting and upholding the rights of refugees and displaced people.
So can you elaborate a little bit on how those intersectionalities of identities and complex, identities be it from race, religion, age, all those vulnerabilities. Can you elaborate how those come together and how we can address each person where they are, because everyone's going to be different with their identity and vulnerabilities? How can we address that?
Absolutely. I mean, you've identified something tremendously important. When a Christian is on the run, every aspect of their identity has the potential to be a compounding factor of vulnerability. So that could be indeed gender, age, ethnicity, or whether they're a convert to Christianity or from a Christian background. Those will all play a role. And therefore, it means that a 40-year-old Christian man who is on the run, he faces different vulnerabilities than a 16-year-old girl who is on the run.
Yeah, so one of the other things I wanted to touch on was I thought it was really interesting how there was a pretty big overlap between your list of the countries where Christians face the most persecution and the countries that produce the most refugees and the most internally displaced persons. So what do you think? Do you think that's just merely a correlation, or do you think there's actually a link there? Do you think it's just that, people who like abuse human rights abuse all types of human rights, or do you think there's a more specific correlation?
Well, I think you found the answer yourself, is that if it is a government or a state that abuses human rights, then it's very likely that they do not have a particularly high regard for human dignity and nor feel a particular responsibility to care for those who are internally displaced. They may even be part of those who are assisting people to cross the border and leave their state. And so we find the top 10 countries with the lowest human freedom indexes by World Population Review all feature on Open Doors World Watch list as high, very high, or extreme levels of persecution. So there is that correlation, and you can find that for many of the human rights. If one is violated, you can expect to see many others violated as well.
Yeah, Liam did a great job getting questions all across the board, but just to let you speak for a moment, is there anything else that you would like the public or anyone to know about this issue that you haven't said yet or you want to expand upon?
I suppose one of the things that really has come through to me and catches my heart as we have done this is the extent to which this could, in so many ways, happen to anyone. So many times we have a habit of looking at refugees and IDPs in their very bedraggled, ragged, and desperate state, and somehow put them in a category as some sort of other creature. They must have done something terribly wrong to find themselves in this situation. And that may inhibit us from reaching out, from either giving to an agency or praying for these people, or just viewing them with compassion in our hearts. And one of the things that I have been struck by as I have traveled, and I spent quite a bit of time in Central African Republic where there were many IDPs, was the number of women that I would sit with, and they would sit down and start to tell their story. And so many of them started out by saying, I had a very good situation in life, and then the Celica came. And so it was that from one day to the next, they went from having a home and a family and being respected in their community, being even leaders in their community. And then the next day they were on their streets with nothing. And they were one of those people. So I suppose just, our perception of people who are on the run, that church on the run, perhaps if we can start to ask ourselves more questions about them and think about them as individuals, that would be a really interesting thing.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really informative and really helpful for us. So we appreciate you taking the time this afternoon.